I use aperture priority mode during most of my shoots no matter what I'm filming, as it really is just such a great tool. Today on the Film Alliance, we will be talking about what, in my opinion, is one of the most important settings in all photography and videography, aperture, with an emphasis on aperture priority, aka A mode or AV mode, depending on what camera you're using. I'll be using the Sony ZV-E10, but every modern camera has aperture priority, so you'll just need to find on your camera where that is. We will be answering these questions. What is it? When and how do I use it? The basics, and for those of you who can hold your breath, we are going to take a deep dive into its functionality. If you're just starting out in photography or video creation, this video is for you. If you're already an experienced photographer or video creator, don't worry, stick around. We will get into the technical aspects and we'll learn some tips and tricks that you may not have known. I'm sure that along your journey, many of you have heard of aperture priority, but if you were asked to explain it to a beginner, would you be able to? If you can, that's great, but if you can't, hopefully you'll be able to by the end. All right, let's jump into it. Before we get into the video, the first question we should ask ourselves is, what is aperture? Aperture is 1/3 of the exposure triangle. We're not about to get into a geometry lesson, but to keep it simple, these are the components of the exposure triangle, which are ISO, shutter speed, and of course aperture. These settings will affect the brightness of your footage and your exposure. These three components are extremely important when learning about the techniques and composition of your videos. The better the understanding you have of ISO, shutter speed, and aperture, the better your final product will turn out. So do not be lazy in learning your exposure triangle. I actually made a video about 2 years ago explaining the exposure triangle in detail, which I will link in the description. Be sure to check it out to get a better understanding of exposure, which will also give you a better understanding of aperture. All right, back to aperture. Aperture is the size of the lens opening. If you're having a hard time understanding aperture, think of it as a human eye. Our eyes adjust to the bright light or the dark conditions by dilating the size of the pupil. Aperture ultimately mimics this concept in that the lens opening adjusts to the different light. It's just manually from the person who's in control of the camera. The wider the aperture, the more light is let into the camera sensor, with the reverse being true. If the aperture is narrow, less light is going to hit the image sensor. When you shoot a video on auto mode, the camera determines what to set the aperture to. With the video set at the bright beach side, the aperture will be super narrow, while if you're in a low light situation, like in some woods or in a city in the afternoon time, the lens will be wide open. Aperture does more than just control how light or dark an image is. It also gives us creative control over how in focus or blurry our background is. I could go on and on about how important aperture is and all it can do for your photos and videos, but I will save that for another video. Please let me know in the comments if you'd like a video on aperture. Today, we're just gonna cover aperture priority. Aperture priority mode lets you manually set your aperture while the camera automatically selects the shutter speed. It allows you to lock in your aperture so you know it's not gonna fluctuate up and down, similar to what cruise control does while you're driving your car. So why do you need to know about aperture priority and when will you use it? That's a great question. Aperture priority gives you full control over the most significant setting in all of photography and videography, aperture. Aperture priority will save you valuable time compared to manual mode, which is the only other way to get in control of the aperture. Manual mode is great, but aperture priority will save you time and enhance your videos. Aperture priority reacts to the changing light automatically, which means less chance of poor exposure. It also maintains almost all of your control over the camera, so you can still choose the best settings for almost any video when it comes to frame rate, shutter speed, and ISO. If I'm out and about and I want to maintain a nice blurry background for a video that I'm shooting, then I'll set my aperture to as low as the lens will go, in this case f1.4, and I'll turn my aperture priority on. Then as the light changes or my framing changes, the shutter speed will fluctuate up and down. In a perfect situation, I wouldn't want my shutter speed to fluctuate all the way up to, say, 1/2000 or more, because that will give me that jittery look in my footage with almost no motion blur. In that case, I would introduce an ND filter like the Freewell K2 magnetic filter system that I'm using in this video. I'll leave a link in the description. I'll walk you through using the aperture priority tool with some basic steps. Aperture priority is fairly simple to use and navigate as long as you understand the exposure triangle. You can easily locate aperture priority on any camera by spinning your camera setting dial to A or AV, or just figuring out where it is inside of the settings. Fuji and Leica cameras don't have a PCAM dial, but you can still get that same effect by turning the shutter speed dial to auto. Just take a quick peek at your manual and it will let you know how to change your camera to aperture priority. Choose your aperture wisely and manually, the f-stop that you would like to use. Choose the appropriate exposure compensation. You will want to make sure that you do not overexpose your video or your photo. I recommend going about -0.03 or -0.7 on the exposure compensation. This way you know you're not blowing out your highlights. Make sure to select the right ISO value. A rule of thumb is to go as low as you can go on the ISO, because the higher you go, the more noise will be introduced into the image. We'll talk more about this later. But for landscape shots, I would say go around f8 with the ISO as low as it can go. If we're shooting video, I'll get my shutter speed to be double my frame rate, but it doesn't really matter to me as long as I'm not shooting fast moving objects. Then I will frame my shot. If I was shooting manual and I was in a perfect lighting condition, then I would set my shutter speed to be double my frame rate. But for the most part, as long as you're not shooting anything that's moving super fast, then you can kind of crank your shutter speed up, which I've done many times. After that, I'll set my frame up, get my focus locked in, and then take my video or photo. The camera will decide on what the shutter speed will be depending on the light that is coming in when my camera is on its tripod. I don't really care what it is. I know it will be stable and I'll have a sharp video. I will also use zebras to see what part of my image is overexposed. If you do have any blowouts, you can use your exposure compensation dial to adjust the aperture priority just a little bit to correct this. If it is blown out, all you have to do is just dial it down a notch. Each click is a third of a stop. When we dial it down 3 clicks, that's 1 full stop of light. You will notice that the image gets darker the more that you adjust it down. We can look on a histogram to see where it's exposed. Remember that when we use a histogram, it will be going off of the JPEG image and not the RAW file. The RAW file will have much larger dynamic range than the JPEG file. I'll have a video on histograms coming up, so be sure to keep an eye out for that one. Once I've uploaded it, I'll add it to the description below. One thing I wish somebody would have told me when I first started out is make sure that the scene that you're shooting looks pretty similar to what's coming out of your display or your EVF. Because if your white balance is off and you're trying to mix or match images in post-production, they're going to be all out of whack. So if you're just starting out, I'd recommend keeping the white balance on auto, as the cameras are pretty good at detecting what the white balance should be. If you're a little bit more advanced, you'll want to dial in that white balance manually, because if you're stacking images or doing composites, you won't want that white balance to change. You'll want to dial that in as closely as you can before you go back to your computer to start processing the images. It makes it much easier when you're processing your images that have already been dialed in as far as white balance goes. The great thing is once you have aperture priority configured, it will stay that way until you manually change it. Obviously, tripod stills are fairly straightforward, but with handheld shots, when you want to get some vlogging, cinematic shots, or even shooting a moving target, things can get a little bit tricky. With aperture priority mode, you must choose your camera's shutter speed. In late evening or dark surroundings, a long shutter speed of around 2 seconds would be very difficult to hold your hands still that long. To avoid this, you have to increase your ISO. The more you increase your ISO, the quicker the shutter will speed up. Now you have the option to increase your ISO manually, but a faster way is to utilize auto ISO. I'll make another video on ISO and auto ISO, and once I do that, I'll leave it in the description below so you can take a look at it. So depending on where you are in your journey while you're watching this, check the description for future videos. With that said, I would not allow ISO on this camera to go above 800. If it goes past 800, then the shadows start to become very noisy and you'll have to apply noise reduction in post-production. If you do use auto ISO, you can always change the range of the ISO sensitivity that is set automatically and set the desired values. For example, here's where I put the limit on how far I will let my camera raise its ISO settings so I don't have to worry about the ISO going too high, in this case above 800. A few quick tips to keep in mind are, shooting sports or quick moving nature videos, I recommend aperture priority with auto ISO. Use a minimum shutter speed of 1/500 to 1/1000 to minimize that blur. For landscapes, cityscapes, and tripod stills, use aperture priority mode without auto ISO. Your shutter speed will slow down, but that's fine while you're using a solid tripod. You can go down to f8 or f11, but I like f11 if it's possible. When using a tripod, turn your active stabilization off or your steady shot off inside of your camera, and then either use a wired or wireless remote or a 2-second timer to reduce the camera shake. I set up the 2-second timer on this camera to minimize that shake. For handheld shots, use Aperture Priority mode with auto ISO and auto minimum shutter speed. For astrophotography, Aperture Priority is very useful, as long as you keep an eye on minimum shutter speed. I shoot Aperture Priority with a negative third stop exposure compensation to preserve the highlight details, things like the stars. On product shots where I'm shooting a camera screen or there's white bright letters, I don't use auto ISO. It's far too unpredictable and usually gives too high of an ISO setting for my liking. I override the camera's basic instincts by just stopping down almost 2 whole stops to make sure those bright numbers don't lose any details and they don't become blown out. Aperture Priority also works with the manual lens. In fact, it makes it easier to go manual on your focus because you can set your aperture priority, and that's one less thing that you have to worry about, which gives you more time to focus on the focus. I really appreciate Aperture Priority and all of the time-saving aspects, but I don't use it all of the time. Also, when I want to control my shutter speed, for example, when shooting sports or freezing action or slowing down action like filming a lake or a waterfall, and I want to slow down the movement, or possibly night photography when I want to capture a shooting star, then I would want to use shutter priority. Overall, Aperture Priority is a tool, and knowing how the various modes on your camera work is key so I can select the correct mode when I'm out. I won't be shooting in only manual or only Aperture Priority 100% of the time. To me, the real importance is being comfortable while I'm shooting in both manual mode and utilizing Aperture Priority. And most of all, having an understanding of the exposure triangle so I can master all of the tools this camera has to offer. If you learned something from this video, be sure to tell a friend so that they may benefit from it as well. Thank you from the Film Alliance, and see you again next week.